Hello everyone. Today I've got a brand new series of spine-chilling horror stories for you. I'm really curious to know which corner of the world you're listening from. Let me know in the comments below. Now, let's get started. That night, it was pouring rain. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and flashes of lightning briefly illuminated my room. My bedroom was on the second floor, with a window that looked out onto a small patch of woods. Normally, the trees outside were quiet, and the rustling of leaves in the breeze would calm me, but tonight, everything felt different. Raindrops beat against the window, their rhythm uneven. I was lying in bed, reading a book. The curtains were open, and every now and then I glanced outside. The rain blurred everything beyond the glass, and I could barely make out the shapes of trees swaying in the wind. As I lost myself in my book, a strange feeling crept over me, the unsettling sensation that someone was watching me. I looked up and stared out the window. Through the rain-streaked glass, I thought I saw a shadow standing at the edge of the woods. I blinked, trying to focus, but the rain made it hard to see clearly. It could have been nothing, maybe just the silhouette of a tree or the wind moving a branch. Yet my heart started to race, and a chill ran through me. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to shake the unease and return to my book. A few minutes passed and I tried to stay focused on reading, telling myself it was just a trick of the weather. But every time lightning flashed, my eyes darted toward the window. And then, in one bright flash, I saw it clearly, a figure at the edge of the woods. My breath caught in my throat. The rain was heavy, and I couldn't make out any details, but there was no doubt now. Someone was standing there. It was a person in a black raincoat, just standing at the edge of the trees, facing my house. They didn't move, and the hood of the coat was pulled low over their face, hiding it completely. My heart began to pound in my chest. I sat up in bed, staring at the window, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence, maybe a passerby who had gotten caught in the storm. But why would they just stand there, unmoving, watching my house? I quickly walked over to the window and yanked the curtains shut, trying to block out the sight. My mind was racing. Who was that? What were they doing out there in the middle of a storm? Were they watching me? I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling slightly, and thought about calling a friend. But it was late, and I didn't want to wake anyone up for what might be nothing. I tried to calm myself down. Maybe they're just waiting for the rain to let up, I told myself. But deep down, I couldn't shake the fear growing inside me. Then, a few minutes later, the doorbell rang. Who could be ringing my doorbell in the middle of a rainstorm? I stayed still, staring toward the bedroom door, too afraid to move. The doorbell rang again, more urgently this time. My heart was racing now, and I could feel the cold sweat forming on my palms. The person from the woods, it had to be them. They had followed me home, and now they were at my front door. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking, ready to call 911, but then I hesitated. What if it was just someone in need? Maybe they were lost or had car trouble. I crept to the top of the stairs and listened for any sounds. Besides the rain and the occasional thunderclap, the house was dead silent. Before I could decide what to do, the doorbell rang for a third time. Frantic, as if the person was pressing it over and over. My mind raced with panic, and I froze in place, too terrified to even go down the stairs. The doorbell stopped, but I knew someone was still out there, waiting just beyond the door. Minutes passed. I didn't move. I just stood there, listening, until finally I heard footsteps. Slow and heavy, they moved away from the front of my house, gradually fading into the sound of the rain. I collapsed onto the floor, my body trembling with fear. I stared blankly at the stairs, my thoughts completely scrambled. I didn't know what had just happened, but I couldn't bring myself to go downstairs to check. The thought of what might be waiting for me outside was too much to bear. After what felt like an eternity, I cautiously approached the window, barely parting the curtain to peek outside. The rain continued to pour down in sheets, and the trees swayed wildly in the wind. The figure was gone, vanished as if they had never been there at all, but the feeling of being watched, that never left. For days after, I tried to push the memory of that night away, convincing myself it was a misunderstanding or a bad prank. But every time the night fell, especially when it rained, I found myself on edge, waiting, watching. I couldn't shake the image of that dark figure, just standing there, so still, so silent. From that night forward, I made sure to always keep my curtains tightly shut. And every time the doorbell rings, a part of me fears that it might be them again, waiting outside in the storm, watching just like before. Even though I never saw that figure again, they haunted my thoughts, lingering at the edges of my mind like a shadow that wouldn't fade. A few months ago, I ended a long-term relationship. To start fresh, I moved into a quiet apartment on the outskirts of the city. It was far from the hustle and bustle, with only a few neighbors, but it was peaceful. I liked it here, feeling like this small apartment was my own sanctuary, especially during my first time living alone. Every night, I would sit on the couch in the living room, either reading or watching TV to unwind before heading to bed. Everything seemed perfectly normal until about 2 weeks ago when I started noticing some strange things happening. At first, it was just little things. One morning, I walked into the kitchen and found a bowl in the sink, even though I distinctly remembered not using it the night before. I thought maybe I had forgotten and didn't dwell on it. I put the bowl back in the cupboard and went about my day. But over the next few days, things started happening more frequently. For example, one night I placed the TV remote on the coffee table before bed, but when I woke up the next morning, I found it on the floor next to the couch. I began to feel uneasy, but I still tried to convince myself that I must have moved it and forgotten. Maybe I was exhausted, or perhaps I wasn't paying attention. Then, one night, something happened that I couldn't ignore. I was fast asleep when I suddenly woke up to a loud thud coming from the living room. It sounded like something heavy had fallen to the floor. My heart started racing, and I quickly became fully awake. I was alone in the apartment, so there shouldn't have been any noise. I took a deep breath and cautiously climbed out of bed, making my way to the living room. When I turned on the light, I saw that all the cushions from the couch were scattered on the floor. My heart nearly stopped. I clearly remembered placing the cushions neatly on the couch before going to bed. There was no way they could have fallen off on their own, and besides, the windows were closed, so it wasn't the wind. A cold chill ran down my spine as I stood there, feeling a growing sense of dread. I kept telling myself it was just a coincidence or something I had overlooked, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Who or what had moved those things? I quickly locked all the doors and windows, checking them over and over again to make sure no one had broken in. But even after locking everything, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, sleep eluded me as I lay in bed, wide awake, replaying the events in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those cushions lying on the floor, as though an invisible hand had thrown them down. In an effort to calm my nerves, I decided to install some security cameras. The next day, I bought a few small cameras and set them up in the living room, kitchen, and by the front door. I told myself that if anything strange happened again, I would at least be able to see what was causing it. A few nights passed without incident, and I began to relax. I started to think that maybe I had overreacted, that the stress from moving and adjusting to living alone was making me paranoid. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. One morning, after checking the footage from the night before, I froze. Around 2 a.m., one of the cushions on the couch moved on its own. The camera clearly captured it. The cushion slowly slid off the couch and fell to the floor, as if someone had pushed it. But there was no one there, just an empty room. I watched the footage over and over again, trying to find any logical explanation, but it was undeniable. The cushion had moved by itself. I sat there stunned and terrified. Every rational part of me tried to come up with an explanation, but there wasn't one. My apartment was empty, the windows were shut, and yet, things were moving as though something was living there with me. I couldn't pretend it wasn't real anymore. This wasn't just some random occurrence or my imagination playing tricks on me. Something was in my apartment, and whatever it wasn't planning on leaving. I immediately called the landlord and started looking for a new place to live. But before I left, I was determined to find out what was happening. I continued monitoring the cameras each night, locking all the doors and windows and waiting for something to happen. Every time I reviewed the footage, a wave of dread washed over me, fearing I'd see those objects moving again. A few days later, the landlord came to check the locks and windows. He told me everything was perfectly fine. There were no signs of forced entry, and structurally, the apartment seemed secure. He dismissed my concerns about the moving objects, suggesting it was probably just my nerves getting the better of me. I could tell he didn't believe me. I tried to explain what I had seen in the footage, but he waved it off, saying it must have been a draft or some other natural cause. But I knew the truth. This was something far from normal. Just before I packed up and left for good, one last thing happened that solidified my decision to never return. That night, as I was getting ready to turn off the lights and go to bed, I heard footsteps coming from the hallway by the front door. They were soft at first, but unmistakable, like someone pacing back and forth. I stood at my bedroom door, frozen, listening as the footsteps continued. I grabbed my phone and quickly checked the live feed from the camera by the door. No one was there, just an empty hallway, but the footsteps didn't stop. I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my things and left that night, never to return. I didn't even bother to come back for the rest of my belongings. Even though I've moved to a new place now, those nights in that apartment still haunt me. I'll never forget what I saw on that footage, those cushions slowly sliding off the couch, as if something invisible was at work. Whatever was in that apartment, it made me realize that some things can't be explained, and some places we're simply not meant to stay in. It was a damp night, with light rain falling outside and the smell of wet earth lingering in the air. I had just finished a long day and was ready to get some early sleep. My apartment was in an old building on the top floor. Though it was small, I liked how quiet and private it felt. At night, everything outside seemed particularly peaceful, with only the gentle sound of raindrops tapping against the window. I was about to turn off the TV and head to bed when I suddenly heard a faint noise coming from the front door. At first, I thought it was just the rain hitting the doormat, but as I listened more carefully, I realized it sounded more like footsteps or someone shifting outside my door. I was puzzled. I couldn't think of anyone who would be standing there at this hour. Most of my neighbors were elderly and usually kept to themselves. Besides, it was already 11 p.m. I walked toward the door, moving quietly, trying not to make any noise that might alert whoever was outside. I pressed my ear against the cold wood of the door, holding my breath. Aside from the rain, I didn't hear anything unusual. I let out a sigh of relief, telling myself it was probably just the wind or maybe my imagination playing tricks on me. Still, to be sure, I decided to check through the peephole. The hallway was pitch dark. The light in the corridor must have gone out at some point. I could only make out the faint outline of the stairs at the end of the hall. I stared for a few more moments, straining my eyes, but I didn't see anyone or anything. Trying to shake off the unease, I stood there for a few more seconds before finally heading back to my bedroom to sleep. A few hours later, I was fast asleep, with only the sound of the rain pattering against the window. Suddenly, I woke up. The room was completely dark except for the faint glow of the streetlights outside. I glanced over at the clock on my nightstand. It was 3 a.m. Just as I was about to turn over and go back to sleep, I heard something strange. It was soft at first, but it was unmistakable. Someone was breathing outside my door. At first I thought I was still half dreaming, but the breathing grew louder, more distinct, like someone was standing just outside the door, leaning against it. My heart began to pound, my limbs growing cold. I stayed completely still in bed, not daring to make a sound, straining to listen. The breathing was slow, steady, and too close for comfort, as if the person was trying to listen to what was happening inside. My pulse quickened, and I slowly sat up in bed, trying to remain calm. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, my fingers trembling as I debated calling 911. Before I could make a decision, I heard something even more terrifying, the faint but unmistakable sound of my door lock turning. The noise was so subtle, but there was no mistaking it. Someone outside was trying to unlock my door. I froze in place, clutching my phone as my heart raced out of control. Who could possibly be trying to get into my apartment? And why? The sound continued for a few more seconds before it abruptly stopped. The lock hadn't opened, but I knew someone had been trying. My mind raced as I stared at the door, not daring to move or make a sound. I finally mustered the courage to dial 911, whispering to the operator about the noise, giving them my address and telling them that someone was trying to break in. The wait felt endless, though it was probably only a few minutes. The silence outside my door was deafening. My entire body was tense, waiting for something else to happen, but the noises had stopped. I sat there on my bed, gripping my phone, staring at the bedroom door as if it might burst open at any moment. Finally, there was a knock on my door, and I heard muffled voices. It was the police. I cautiously walked to the door, checking through the peephole before opening it. 2 officers stood outside, rainwater dripping from their uniforms. They informed me they had checked the building but hadn't found anyone suspicious. "Are you sure someone was trying to unlock your door?" one of the officers asked, his tone slightly skeptical. "I'm sure," I replied, my voice shaky. I heard the lock turning, and before that I heard breathing outside my door. They stepped inside and inspected the lock, but there were no signs of forced entry, no scratches, nothing out of the ordinary. Everything appeared perfectly intact, as if no one had been there at all. I could feel the officer's doubt, but I knew what I had heard. The cold, damp sensation still lingered on the door handle, as if someone had touched it with wet hands. The officers left soon after, advising me to call if anything else happened. But as I sat alone in my apartment, I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep again that night. The eerie feeling of being watched, of someone standing just outside my door, lingered long after the police were gone. The next day, I called my landlord and insisted they change the locks. I also installed a security camera outside my door, desperate for some sense of security. But even with those precautions, I never felt safe again in that apartment. Every time I returned home, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to try again. Even after I moved out, the memory of that strange, unsettling night stayed with me. I could still hear the sound of that breathing, feel the cold presence on the other side of the door. Whoever it was that night, whoever had stood outside my door trying to get in, I never found out. But I can't shake the fear that one day they'll try again, this time somewhere else, maybe with someone else. And that thought haunts me more than anything else. That's today's story. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe to my channel, and turn on the notification bell. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.